Just because his girlfriend scolded him, saying he deserved to be single forever, he angrily hacked into all the Harvard girls' computers, downloaded their private photos, and created a website for Harvard guys to rate the girls. Unexpectedly, the site went live at 2 a.m. and within 2 hours, the massive traffic crashed the school's server, forcing the staff to work overtime in the middle of the night. The next day, he became the enemy of all the girls at school and was given a disciplinary warning, with a 6-month probation. Unexpectedly, this incident turned out to be a blessing in disguise for him. Soon after, he not only founded the world's largest social platform but also grew it into a business empire worth over $1 trillion, becoming the world's youngest billionaire. He is Facebook's founder, Mark Zuckerberg. This movie will take you through the story of a genius who hides loneliness with gifts, a young man torn between emotions and ambition, and how he built the world's leading social network from scratch, and why he fell out with his former best friend, starting from that night when Mark chatted with his girlfriend at the bar. For Mark, whose intelligence is determined by his brain but has almost zero emotional intelligence, he seems not to understand what small talk is, nitpicking his girlfriend's words and randomly changing topics. In just 5 minutes of conversation, he switched topics 4 times, from the number of geniuses in China surpassing the US population, to which club to join, and finally casually mocking his girlfriend for attending a mediocre university. His words infuriated his girlfriend, who lashed out. "Maybe you'll achieve something in IT, but people like you deserve to be single forever." Then, she angrily got up and left. Dumped, Mark jogged back to his dorm, sat in front of his computer, and started blogging, mocking his girlfriend, calling her a wallpaper and ridiculing her flat chest, saying she relies on push-ups. After posting, he still felt unsatisfied. At this moment, he heard his roommate's idea. Put apartment photos together and let them compare attractiveness. This prank inspired Mark. He didn't want to compare people to animals, but comparing people, especially girls, seemed interesting. But Harvard didn't have a unified yearbook, so he hacked into each girl's dorm and downloaded their photos. In less than 4 hours, he had most of the girls' photos from the school. Then he created a website for side-by-side comparisons. Harvard guys picked the sexiest one in their hearts, but they needed a smart algorithm. Just then, Mark's friend Edward visited. Edward is an economics major and an algorithm genius. He came to comfort Mark after reading about his breakup on a blog. Mark needed him. Recently, a math formula used by speculators. This formula can dynamically assess a girl's charm based on visitor ratings. Soon, Mark turned the formula into a program called FaceMesh. After emailing it to a few friends, the makeshift website started spreading among Harvard students. Nerds eagerly rated familiar female classmates. In less than 2 hours, the page had over 20,000 hits. Harvard's internal servers crashed, forcing admins to fix them overnight. Soon, Mark's actions made the school paper. He was brought before the school committee for review. He was sentenced to 6 months of probation for privacy violations. The site was ordered to shut down by the committee. Though Mark admitted leaking photos was wrong, he didn't think he endangered public safety. Instead, he felt he found a school flaw and deserved praise. But no matter how smart or stubborn, he became the enemy of all the girls. Even during class, he received notes cursing him. Just when he thought he hit rock bottom, 2 6 feet 6 inches twins approached him. At first, Mark thought they were defending the girls, but they wanted him for his skills. The twins were planning a Harvard-exclusive social site. Harvard students could post their info and photos. Based on party experience, they believed all girls wanted to date Harvard guys, predicting the site would be a hit. But they needed a skilled programmer. After seeing Mark's story, they reached out to him for collaboration. Faced with the offer, Mark agreed without hesitation. But he never intended to join. It was a stalling tactic, as he had a better idea inspired by the twins. But before his idea became reality, he couldn't let the twins' site launch first. You can't tell them your thoughts. So, he turned to his friend Edward. We can build a social platform where users edit and upload profiles. This avoids privacy issues. If you put in $10 as startup, we'll split future income 70/30ths. Edward thought it was promising and agreed to join. After the first investment, Mark coded day and night. During this time, the twins asked to meet, but he made excuses. In 42 days, the site was done, and the Facebook was registered. Meanwhile, Mark texted the twins saying their project wasn't appealing. Later, inspired by a classmate, he added a relationship status feature. This small feature would bring big changes to the Facebook. Once ready, the Facebook launched. To get users, Mark used Edward's connections to send links to Harvard's elite. Soon, Facebook spread like a virus, with over 60 registrations in 2 days. However, the twins quickly noticed Facebook. They were from a prestigious family and had never been so deceived. Even though furious, Cameron didn't want to fight, as it wasn't gentlemanly. So, he had his father's lawyer send Mark a legal notice. Mark didn't see it as a threat since he hadn't used their code. But Edward was furious, fearing a lawsuit and because Mark never mentioned it. As a co-founder, Edward was willing to stand by Mark, but trust was essential. Mark promised it wouldn't happen again. In 2 weeks, the Facebook exploded in popularity, and "add me on Facebook" became a catchphrase. With their names on the site, Mark and Edward became campus celebrities. Even the girls who used to ignore them started flirting. But just as Mark was feeling on top of the world, his ex-girlfriend publicly embarrassed him. That day, he and Edward had just had a fling with admirers in the restroom when they saw his ex-girlfriend who had once dumped him. He wanted to show off in front of his ex, but she hadn't even heard of Facebook. This hurt Mark's pride and made him realize his achievements couldn't just be at Harvard. So he decided to expand the team, making Edward the CFO with 30% of the original shares. His friend Dustin became the VP of technology and got 5% of the shares. They also hired intern programmers to code, aiming to quickly conquer Boston University, where his ex was, and nearby Yale and Columbia. Edward also suggested adding Stanford, given the close ties between Harvard and Stanford. Little did he know, 2 years later, Edward would regret this suggestion on a rainy night in California. Because he would meet his lifelong rival, Sean Parker, in San Francisco, where Stanford is. Sean was a notorious playboy but also a renowned young genius. At 19, he developed Napster, a free music download software. Though he lost a lawsuit over copyright issues, he saw the trend of digital music overtaking physical records. But the lawsuit's compensation left him broke. This made him desperately need a promising investment to fill his pockets. Coincidentally, he woke up in a Stanford girl's bed and saw the Facebook page open, recognizing its huge potential. Later, the Facebook indeed became globally famous under his operation. But before that, the Facebook ran into trouble because Mark's expansion plans reached the twins. The younger brother suggested hiring a lawyer to shut down the Facebook because the longer it was online, the less valuable their Harvard club would be. However, the older brother thought such actions were too crude. At that moment, the younger brother remembered the Harvard handbook stated stealing from other students was prohibited. This gave them hope, and they decided to report to the dean. So the next day, they used their father's connections. They got a chance to meet the principal. However, faced with the brother's lengthy complaints, the principal said, "If your idea hasn't been realized, then it's just an idea. At Harvard, everyone has ideas. Instead of worrying about stolen ideas, why not start a new project?" When the twins angrily claimed their idea was worth millions, the principal couldn't help but laugh. As a former U.S. Treasury Secretary, he didn't believe a student's idea could be that valuable. Of course, he couldn't imagine Facebook's future value reaching trillions. The twins' lawsuit eventually failed, while Facebook had already expanded to 29 universities with nearly 80,000 active members. With these assets, CFO Eduardo began thinking about how to make a profit, and the only revenue model he could think of was pop-up ads. But Mark was strongly opposed to this because he felt the site was in a rapid growth phase, and no one knew what it would become. Introducing pop-up ads suddenly could ruin it. However, under Eduardo's insistence, he agreed to meet with New York advertisers. During negotiations, he deliberately disrupted the talks, successfully derailing the deal. They arranged several more meetings, but none piqued Mark's interest until Eduardo's girlfriend introduced them to Sean, who was interested in Facebook. Before meeting, Mark admired this young, successful entrepreneur. After meeting, he was even more impressed by Sean's confidence. What was supposed to be a group dinner quickly became Sean's personal showcase. Most importantly, Sean's vision for Facebook was identical to Mark's. They both believed it wasn't the right time to introduce ads. Otherwise, it would be like being at a party and suddenly being told it ends at 1 a.m., a buzzkill. Additionally, Sean painted a big picture for Mark, saying that Facebook's future commercial value wouldn't be less than $1 billion. However, what truly won Mark over was Sean's parting words. "Drop it from the Facebook. It will be cleaner." This indeed was an epic change, but it also laid the groundwork for Mark and Eduardo's eventual split. Edward never liked Sean, not just because of his chaotic personal life, but also because he used shady means to surpass 2 internet companies in exams. Edward worried he would harm Facebook's growth. There was also a selfish reason. He feared Sean's presence would weaken his influence. However, Mark clearly supported Sean's ideas, leading to increasing conflicts with Edward. A few months later, Facebook's users exceeded 150,000. Edward wanted to continue seeking monetization opportunities in New York, while Mark, influenced by Sean, decided to move the base to California during the summer. Unable to convince each other, they decided to act separately. Before parting, Edward generously gave Mark $180 for all his expenses in California, thinking nothing major would change in just 3 months. Unexpectedly, during this time, the distance between him and Mark grew. In California, Mark rented a villa with a pool, where a group of people spent their time coding and entertaining themselves in the yard. One day, they played a game that damaged a chimney, attracting the neighbors' attention. Surprisingly, it was Sean Parker, who, as usual, was with a pretty girl. Learning that Mark moved to California for work, Sean was thrilled, and when he found out Edward didn't come, he had a meaningful smile. That night, to show hospitality, Sean took Mark to a nightclub. Not for fun, but to drive a wedge between him and Edward. Sean wanted to join Facebook, but his role overlapped with Edward's, so he needed to push Edward out. First, Sean used the example of the Victoria's Secret founder selling the brand cheaply and then jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge to remind Mark not to repeat the same mistakes. Then, he said, "You and I are the same kind of people, capable of becoming big players, while Edward is just a worker for capital. We are the ones who can change the game and create real value." Although Mark still trusted and relied on Edward, when Sean promised to help expand Facebook across Europe, he decided to secretly bring Sean on board. The result did not disappoint him, as Facebook quickly became popular throughout Europe. Meanwhile, the twin brothers, unaware of the news, were attending the Royal Regatta in the UK. Despite giving it their all during the race, they ended up in second place by just half a second. At the post-race party, the two were downcast, but soon, Yuko and I managed to cheer them up. However, just then, they learned that Facebook had expanded beyond the US and was going global. This news made the already upset brothers even angrier, and they immediately decided to sue Mark, cursing and forgetting their past grievances. Soon, both parties were in court. But facing the twins' accusations of idea theft, Mark completely disagreed, even publicly stating that Facebook was nothing like their pimping idea. "Everything my colleagues and I are doing now, you couldn't come up with even if you tried." Additionally, when asked why he initially sought investment from Eduardo instead of the wealthy twins, Mark said it was because Eduardo was the president of the Harvard Investment Association and, more importantly, he was a good friend whom he trusted and wanted to work with. However, the opposing lawyer pointed out that this good friend was now suing him for $600,000. It turned out that after Facebook's European launch, Mark was so busy coding that he completely forgot about Eduardo's trip to California. Eduardo had to brave the rain and come to the company on his own. This situation already upset her, and to make matters worse, the first person she saw upon arrival was Sean, whom she disliked, along with a room full of partying underage girls. Moreover, through Mark's introduction, she learned that Sean had not only joined the company but had almost completely taken over her role. To make matters worse, while she struggled to find advertisers, Sean had arranged meetings with major investors. Eduardo hoped Mark would side with him, but Mark not only dismissed her contributions to the company but also emphasized Sean's importance. This pushed Eduardo to the brink of anger, leading him to make a decision he would regret for life. In a fit of rage, he froze all company accounts and immediately returned to New York. However, upon returning home, he got into an argument with his girlfriend. Previously, their relationship had already been strained, with Eduardo always being the weaker party, unable to stand up to his girlfriend's controlling nature or initiate a breakup. This time, faced with his girlfriend's aggression, he tried to make peace with a scarf he had bought in advance. But his girlfriend had never worn a scarf before, and this time she was upset because Edward's relationship status on Facebook was set to single. However, as a co-founder, Edward had no idea how to change that status. Just then, Edward's phone rang, and his girlfriend thought it was her lover from California, but it turned out to be Mark calling. Edward should have been very afraid of Mark's call, but he was eager to answer it and rushed to the bathroom. Mark had discovered that the bank card was frozen and angrily scolded Edward over the phone, saying he shouldn't have done that. He accused Edward of being childish because no matter how big the internal disagreements were, they shouldn't harm the company. If the funding chain breaks, the servers will go down, and even a day's downtime could trigger a domino effect, destroying Facebook, a platform based on user relationships. Edward initially wanted to use this method to prove his importance in the company, but now he realized the seriousness of the issue. Fortunately, it was discovered in time, and no major disaster occurred. Mark was willing to let bygones be bygones and move on. Then he announced some great news. The investor they met earlier was very optimistic about Facebook's future and decided to invest $500,000 and provide a proper office. However, with new capital coming in, the company had to be restructured. Mark asked Edward to quickly fly to Los Angeles to sign some very important documents. The unexpected surprise made Edward very excited, and it seemed to give him the confidence and courage to break up with his girlfriend. Afterward, Edward took the next flight overnight to the new office in San Francisco, where two lawyers had been waiting for a long time. They showed Edward 4 agreements, but Edward didn't look closely. He only asked about the share distribution. Upon learning that Mark held 51%, he held 34%, and Sean held only 6.47%. Edward was satisfied with the distribution. So, as a top student in Harvard's economics department, he signed without reading the agreement's content. Little did he know, his best friend Mark took this opportunity to outsmart him a few months later. Facebook's users are about to surpass 100,000. Mark plans to host a celebration party at the company and specifically told Eduardo to attend. On that day, Eduardo not only showed up as promised but also dressed up nicely. Little did he know, he was walking into an ambush. It turns out, over the past few months, Mark quietly issued over 200,000 new shares, and in his designed equity structure, everyone's shareholding remained unchanged except Eduardo's, which was diluted from 34% to 0.3%. Moreover, he was also ousted by Facebook's famous co-founder, Elon. His name, because in the previous 4th agreement, he voluntarily signed away his shareholder voting rights, giving Mark full authority in his absence. At this point, Eduardo finally realized he was betrayed by his friend. Once inseparable best friends had become courtroom adversaries. Eduardo really wanted to know when Mark decided to kick him out of the company. Mark didn't answer this question. Eduardo originally guessed it was during the funding freeze, but then he thought it might have been earlier, as early as when Facebook was just born. Because back then, Eduardo passed numerous tests to successfully join the Phoenix Club, which Mark wanted to join but ultimately wasn't qualified for. And this made Mark extremely envious, but at that time, he needed the Phoenix Club's connections to promote Facebook, so after using Eduardo, he had to list him as a co-founder. But later, after meeting Sean, their differences grew, and Mark was suddenly inexplicably accused by Sean of animal abuse. As one of Facebook's co-founders, this was undoubtedly detrimental to Facebook's development. Afterward, Mark used this incident to counter Eduardo's accusations, blaming him for damaging the company's image and etiquette. However, in fact, that incident was just a misunderstanding. At that time, Eduardo had just joined the Phoenix Club, and as part of the initiation, he had to carry a chick with him. It turned out that day, the school cafeteria was serving chicken, and he had to feed the chick, so he ended up feeding it chicken, leading to accusations of forcing the chick to eat its kind. Although eventually, the matter was settled, and Mark casually said he didn't mind, Eduardo then realized that perhaps that incident was also set up by Mark. However, all of this had no evidence, and since Eduardo was already out, dwelling on it was pointless. In this long-planned capital trap, some lost everything while others rose to power. However, even though Xiao-En got what she wanted, she didn't seem completely satisfied. So, she publicly humiliated her defeated opponent by pulling out the $190 check Edward initially invested and mocked her, saying it's a pity it can't be cashed because your has been frozen. Although Mark didn't comment during this conflict, after Edward left, he suddenly accused Xiao-En of going too far. This was the first time they argued. Meanwhile, Facebook's users officially surpassed 100,000, less than a year since its launch. Everyone in the company was cheering, except Mark, who seemed a bit lonely. This was supposed to be his dream moment, but now he couldn't find anyone to share the joy with. After the official celebration, Xiao-En organized a second party, but Mark didn't go. Instead, he stayed alone at the company. Luckily, he didn't attend because he soon learned from Xiao-En that at the party, they diluted unfinished products. And many minors were involved. When the police found out, they took everyone to the station. Xiao-En suspected it was Edward's revenge. Otherwise, how could they coincidentally encounter a police inspection? But Mark firmly stated it was impossible. He then said it's not the time to dwell on this, as the incident of high officials encouraging underage activities would quickly spread online, causing immeasurable negative impact on the company. I need to quickly find a solution. But before he could offer a solution, he got entangled in lawsuits with the twins and Edward. Despite previous negotiations with lawyers and confrontations with the other parties, the whole day ended without results. Mark's lawyer told him that if they don't settle, the next step is legal proceedings. Given the evidence and Mark's actions, the jury might not favor him, meaning Mark is likely to lose. So, settling and paying is the wisest choice now. After all, Mark is already a billionaire, and the compensation is just a drop in the bucket for him. After a moment of thought, Mark decided to accept this outcome and then told his lawyer, "I'm not a bad person." The lawyer replied to him with a meaningful look, saying, "You're not quite a jerk yet, but you're working hard to become one." In the end, Mark paid the twins $6.05 million, and Eduardo's name was reinstated as one of the founders. After the lawyer left, Mark found his ex-girlfriend on Facebook, sent a friend request, and sat in front of the computer, refreshing the page to see if she accepted. One of the initial motivations for creating Facebook was to prove his worth to his ex-girlfriend. Now, he's a top young billionaire but can't get a glance from his first love and has lost the only friend who truly cared for him. The Social Network, directed by David Fincher and starring Jesse Eisenberg and Andrew Garfield, is a biographical film released in 2010. However, it's not a traditional biography but adapted from a novel, with most of the plot being fictional. Director David Fincher admitted that this is a biographical film mixed with fiction and facts. Moreover, there's an unwritten rule in Hollywood that if the subject of a biographical film is still alive, the script should be shown to them. However, this film was made without Zuckerberg's approval. After the film's release, Zuckerberg stated that the plot indeed differs from reality, as no one would be foolish enough to write formulas on glass. However, Zuckerberg didn't sue the filmmakers, perhaps because this movie is less of a personal biography and more of a story about friendship, betrayal, jealousy, and the issues of the era. Mark is a genius with many flaws. Despite his high IQ and exceptional talent, he's selfish and arrogant, never considering others' feelings. His ex-girlfriend broke up with him for this reason, but he never introspects, instead believing she looked down on him and attacking her online with vicious words to vent his anger. Eduardo was the only friend who genuinely cared for him, rushing to comfort him after his breakup. Yet, When Mark learned Eduardo joined the Phoenix Club, he immediately showed defiance and jealousy, even plotting and executing revenge. However, it was precisely his strong pride and competitiveness that made him secretly vow to achieve great success and put everyone beneath him. And that's how Facebook's social empire came to be. But when he finally succeeded, he didn't feel the joy he imagined, nor the thrill of surpassing peers. Instead, he felt deeper emptiness and loneliness. This is because he misunderstood why he wasn't liked or accepted from the start. He longed to fit in and be recognized, but his insecurity led him to belittle and hurt others, thinking it would earn their respect. Little did he know, it only pushed people further away. Yet, he's not really a jerk, more like a pitiable person incapable of love. In the end, despite his billions, he became a lonely man, without true happiness. Another reason Mark started Facebook was to bring people closer together. Indeed, people can make friends with anyone in the world through the internet. However, as the line between virtual and reality blurs, loneliness, anxiety, and emptiness spread rapidly. When the internet goes down, it's like the world turns dark. The happier online, the offline, becoming everyone's reality. Besides severely affecting real relationships, the internet magnifies the worst in human nature. Like many vicious and insulting words, people wouldn't say them so easily in real life. Even with low EQ or poor character, they hesitate due to fear of consequences. Yet, in the virtual world, people act without restraint. They write the harshest words in dark rooms, like masked executioners. But that's how times progress, no one can change it, and we can't turn back. We can only hold on to our original ideals in this unstoppable flow. Alright, that's all for today's movie. Feel free to like, comment, and share. Looking forward to our next meeting.